As Donald Trump escalates his mass deportation plans and bullies and threatens leaders from Mexico to Colombia to Panama, are U.S.-Latin American relations at an all-time low? And how does Washington's history of meddling in the Americas inform the present moment? I'll ask those questions to Pulitzer Prize-winning author and history professor at Yale University, Greg Grandin. Greg Grandin, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thanks for having me.
With Donald Trump back in the White House, his administration has swiftly begun implementing its mass deportation agenda. Across the country, we're seeing raids, racial profiling, sweeping arrests by U.S. immigration and customs officials. All of it has led to the detention and deportation of thousands of migrants. As these crackdowns intensify, what does this surge in ICE raids signal about the broader direction of U.S. immigration policy under the second Trump administration?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's hard to separate the spectacle from what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, there's a lot of reports that they've rigged the algorithms of Google in order to bring up raids that happened years ago, just to make it appear that they're doing more than they're actually doing. I mean, just this week they announced they're not releasing any more numbers about how many immigrants that they've detained and are deporting. They're not releasing the figures, not releasing the numbers. In many ways, it's a continuation of the tally under the Biden administration. We're seeing a couple hundred people a day, couple of thousand people a week, but this is not significantly higher than what was going on.
Well, that's interesting. So
Joe Biden or Barack Obama before the
deporter in chief, as some people call it.
Yeah. Deportations have been part of U.S. policy. It's just a question of to what degree do you politicize it? Do you turn it into a spectacle? And that's what Donald Trump does.
So it would be fair to say that Donald Trump is not worse than his Democratic predecessors. He just has a different rhetoric.
In actual numbers, I don't think so. I think the reality is the United States actually doesn't have the capacity to do the kind of mass deportation that he has promised his base. And you have, and it's the Democratic Party, Mark, that goes out of its way to run to the right of whatever the Republican position is on immigration. And so you have senators like Chris Murphy tweeting out that Donald Trump isn't keeping up with Biden's numbers on deportation. So in many ways, it's much more about the spectacle, the acts of cruelty, the using the military planes, the showing the people in shackles and leg irons being deported. That is what Trump likes. I mean, there was just a report that they were taking old press releases of raids that happened under the Obama administration and changing the date and uploading it. So therefore, anybody who did a search, it comes up with the current date.
On February 3rd, Reuters reported that Donald Trump's administration had actually stepped up the arrests, though, picking up about 1,000 people per day, which was 3 times the daily average of last year. Now, it seems that something at least is happening here that's different than what we've seen before. Is there at least a worry? Do you have any concern that things could get worse?
Yes. I mean, Tom Homan, the director of ICE, has said that they're going to widen the aperture of who gets targeted. They're going to go from people who are criminals to people who are in the country with undocumented.
The Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah, waiting for us, But again, in many ways, the reality is the rhetoric and the spectacle is far outstripping the reality. Yeah. Trump campaigned on a mass deportation. I mean, we know the way he talks. We know the language he uses. We know the numbers that he pulls out of thin air. Millions of people. It's the state's capacity of deporting that as many people as Trump has promised just doesn't exist. And we're already hearing reports that ICE is releasing detainees back into the population with ankle bracelets to show up at a hearing rather than deporting them. In many ways, exactly what happened under Biden and under Obama. But again, it's the spectacle. And now there's two ways of thinking about it. There's the argument that the cruelty is the point. right? And we need to have spectacles of cruelty because that's what feeds, the Trump base. And it doesn't matter if the reality it doesn't match that. People think it is.
Trump would say the cruelty is an argument for dissuading people from coming as well.
Yeah.
Though. Like if we create the spectacle, we won't have the immigrant, the undocumented alien crisis.
I think so, but I think the spectacle is for domestic consumption. I think it's for his base. I think people are going to come. I mean, nobody takes that journey. Nobody puts their children in that kind of jeopardy unless the conditions of their survival where they are is worse than what's ahead. And no rhetoric, no images of people being deported and back to home country is going to stop people from trying to get to a place where they could survive and have a better life.
That's an important point you raise, and let's drill down on that a little bit, because there's an argument from Trump and his allies that people do make a choice, and if we just make it harder, they won't come. If we can make it a difficult process, they will be dissuaded from showing up. I'm hearing you say, no, the conditions are so bad where they are that nothing could stop them from coming. How do we get there? How do we get to that point where people's conditions at home are so bad that they're willing to abandon their homeland, their country, their houses, their farms, whatever, and come to this country, even with great peril?
Yeah, well, first let me say that calculation, make it as difficult as possible, that didn't begin with Trump, it didn't begin with Biden, it didn't begin with Obama, it began with Bill Clinton. It been shutting down safe border crossing routes through urban areas like El Paso and forcing people out into the desert. Now, why did they come? I mean, there's a lot of reasons. The United States is the wealthiest nation in world history. It has jobs and people, and it has a demand for low-skilled, low-pay labor. In many of these places, it's actual U.S. policy which creates the hardship, which drives the migration forward. I mean, we could look at, and this goes back, we could look at the Central American wars, we could look at economic policy, free trade policy. NAFTA devastated small farmers in Mexico, and it led to mass migration both into Mexico City and north. And again, the Clinton administration knew this because the Clinton administration's militarization of the border wasn't technically part of NAFTA, but it took place at the same time. They knew that the free trade agreement that basically gutted subsidies to small farmers.
I was going to say, let's drill down on that just so the audience has a clear idea. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, right? It's imposed in
1993. It's negotiated by the George H.W. Bush administration, but Clinton is the one who gets it through the Senate and House and ratifies it and signs it. And what it does is it allows capital and commodities to flow freely across the border, but it has no provisions at all for labor. But what it also did was it did nothing to take away subsidies to U.S. agro industry. Right, the $14 trillion farm bill or whatever it is still in place. The multi-year farm bill, which funds Cargill and funds Monsanto and makes Kansas corn, cheap. That gets dumped into Mexico, and Mexican farmers, Mexican campesinos can't compete with it. And so within the first 5 years of NAFTA, something like 5 million people lost their farms in Mexico, and the people who signed NAFTA and signed NAFTA knew it would create this dislocation, and that's why they simultaneously began to militarize the border and shut down the border because they thought that would lock the. So
you impose policies that kick people off their farms, and then when they're fleeing to go somewhere, we close the door.
Yeah, same thing with Haiti. The policies. When Bill Clinton returned Jean-Bertrand Aristide to power after the coup, he only did it on condition that Aristide adopt a whole set of policies that go under the rubric neoliberalism. Cutting subsidies and tariffs that protected, say, Haitian rice farmers or Haitian cement builders. And it devastated the country, it devastated the industry. And basically, yes, it's what falls under the rubric of neoliberalism or the Washington Consensus or economic restructuring, whatever you want to call it, Reaganomics, it has had an enormously devastating effect in poor countries, and it drives migrations. Added to that is the increasing reliance on sanctions the sanctions we imposed on Cuba, the sanctions we imposed on Venezuela. The reason why so many Venezuelans are coming is because Trump and Biden imposed very harsh economic sanctions because they were opposed to Nicolas Maduro and they were hoping for regime change.
So let's talk about that, because we've sort of talked about sanctions and this sort of meddling in Latin America in the past tense, but it's still happening, right?
Yeah, of course. The sanctions are all in place.
Sanctions against Venezuela are still happening. They've devastated the economies you've talked about. They've fueled thousands of deaths. The United States has supported far right-wing coups in places like Bolivia. And they funded security forces responsible for widespread human rights violations across the region through the so-called war on drugs. I mean, all of this stuff is happening. How is this different than the Cold War era?
Well, I would say it's different in one sense, in that during the Cold War era, I think there was the existence of an ideological competitor in the form of the Soviet Union forced the United States to socialize itself a little bit, to not go full on in terms of austerity and free market economic policies. You take away the Soviet Union. I mean, think about this. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991, and the United States immediately imposes policies on itself as if it was a belligerent nation. It starts expanding the prison system. It starts militarizing the police. It deindustrializes. It starts gutting its industrial base.
And you see this as a response to the fall of the Soviet Union, as opposed to just the kind of inevitabilities of neoliberalism.
Yeah, I think the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed the United States to imagine economic globalization on its fullest scale, and that include domestic restructuring. And the thing about what every major country, every wealthy country restructured in the 1990s to one degree or another as a result of inflation, high energy prices. No country gutted the institutions that could have ameliorated that restructuring as devastatingly as the United States did to itself, in terms of destroying unions, rolling back welfare policies, anything that could have ameliorated the worst effects of restructuring, the United States cut. No other Western country, not even the UK, did it to such a degree as the United States. And that's American exceptionalism.
That brings me to the Monroe Doctrine, which you talk about in your forthcoming book, America. This was a doctrine created under U.S. President James Monroe in 1823 as a response to Latin American independence movements. Talk to me about this doctrine. How does it continue to influence U.S. policy in the Americas 2 centuries later?
Yeah, the actual Monroe Doctrine was just a couple of paragraphs in James Monroe's State of the Union address. And they weren't even contiguous paragraphs. They basically said the United States was going to recognize the independence of Latin America, South American nations, Spanish American nations, and that it wouldn't allow their reconquest by European powers. Now, Latin Americans liked that part. They read it. They thought they were hearing a kind of anti-colonial sentiment. There would not be a recolonization of the Americas by Europe. But over the years, the Monroe Doctrine took on a different, almost kind of mystical power beyond the actual words that composed it. It came to signify that the United States had mandatory authority over the hemisphere, that wherever there was a threat to the United States' interests within the hemisphere, the U.S. had the right to act. And so the Monroe Doctrine became a symbol of this kind of informal empire. The United States is taking upon itself the authority to police the hemisphere. And, it's associated in many ways. It came to be associated with what we would call the kind of Trumpist or nationalist. It's the idea that the United States is not necessarily responsible for superintending the globe, but that it's going to exercise mandatory authority within its own hemisphere, right? That Latin America is the United States' backyard. So in many ways, it was this idea that there were regional powers with spheres of influence that those powers had the right and obligation to police.
It seems like Trump might be doing that now in a warmer and fuzzier way, right?
Exactly.
It's not politically palatable to just say, hey, I'm taking over this place, or hey, I'm controlling your politics. But he does do some interesting things here. I mean, since he's taken office, he's threatened to use military force against Panama. He signed an executive order renaming the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America.
Not America.
Right. exactly. And he's threatened a trade war with Mexico. Some Latin American leaders, like Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, have stood up to Trump's rhetoric, and Honduran President Xiomara Castro has even threatened to shut down a U.S. military base if he carries out the mass deportation plans. Are U.S.-Latin American relations at an all-time low at this point?
Well, Trump, it's interesting. They are at a low. I think the turn to Latin America does coincide with the kind of Trumpist vision of the world in which the United States is no longer the global hegemon. Trump is, in some ways, pulling back. We're seeing it in Europe with France and Germany pushing back over Trump's plans for a negotiated settlement over the war in Ukraine. We're seeing it in many ways, and what it does entail is a kind of recession back to a kind of hemispheric understanding of territorial power, with the United States projecting its power within Latin America. But there's a couple of things going on here. In Latin America is still overwhelmingly governed by leftist coalitions. Out of 620 million people that live in Latin America, about 400 million of them live under presidents who call themselves socialists or social democrats. Chile, Colombia, Brazil. But in many ways, and the right is confined to countries like El Salvador and Argentina, but Trump has a potential base within Latin America. There is the possibility of creating a kind of Pan-American Trumpism, the spread of culture war politics, anti-wokeism, wokeismo in Latin America, it's called.
Dios mío.
Yeah, I know. In every country, there's the anti-gender heterodoxy. This clampdown on an expansion of gay rights and abortion rights, and in many ways, it's taken an expression that's very familiar within the United States. That basically brought Trump to power. This kind of conspiracism, this kind of cultural politics. Javier Milei in Argentina says we have to fight the culture war every day. There he is in the trenches going after the teachers, going after abortion rights, going after, passing laws that limit, that place severe restrictions on transgender people expressing themselves and transitioning. So there's culture war politics within Latin America that is very familiar to the United States. And Trump has the potential to kind of build on that. But at the same time, though, by doing things like saying he's going to take back the Panama Canal by force, that he's going to rename, the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, that he's going to seize Greenland. It awakens a certain kind of anti-imperialist sentiment in Latin America, a kind of reaction. The ideal of sovereignty is very cherished in Latin America, and it's cherished because they had to live in the shadow of an expanding United States that seized Texas, that seized half of Mexico, that seized Puerto Rico, that took Cuba, and then administered it as an informal colony until 1959. So there's kind of Trump. It's unclear exactly which direction Trump will go in Latin America. There's the neocons. Look who he appointed Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Up until a few years ago, he was down with the neocon agenda. Now he's adjusted himself, and he's sounding a little bit like an American firster, But Rubio's agenda in Latin America, what's Rubio's agenda? Squeeze Cuba until it breaks, oust Maduro in Venezuela, oust Ortega in Nicaragua, and force Brazil to lift the ban on Jair Bolsonaro participating in the election in 2026. He's banned from participating in the 2026 election because of his involvement in the earlier coup and assassination attempt against Lula. So there's a whole neocon agenda in Latin America. If Trump lets Rubio off leash, then what we're going to see is quite a degree of chaos and crisis in Latin America.
Donald Trump has taken significant actions to dismantle U.S. aid, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the National Endowment for Democracy, by ordering a near total freeze on all foreign aid. Now, these cuts will lead to the gutting of vital health care and education programs abroad. But both agencies have also been accused of operating as covert instruments of U.S. foreign policy. As we see more America First policies, as they're often labeled, do you think U.S. influence abroad is going to diminish?
Well, I guess the question is how much do some of these policies get picked up by other agencies within the State Department. But yes, I mean, the targeting of USAID is fascinating because it really is a signal that the United States is announcing that it is no longer going to superintend the world, right? And AID is a perfect expression of a kind of the fusion of hard and soft power. I mean, it does important and humane work, and I think it was funding the only working hospital left in Gaza, things like that, and dispensing medicines in Africa, but it was also the agency in which that funded democracy promotion programs, and these were all, when the National Endowment for Democracy, which operates under AID, was founded in 1983 under the Reagan administration. The first director of it said, we do in the open what the CIA used to do covertly, meaning that they fund oppositional groups. And in countries that are friendly, they just fund a whole range of civil society groups. In countries that are kind of a problem, they fund those groups that are kind of parallel to potentially problematic organizations. So if you have a left-leaning union, you'll fund a U.S.-friendly union. If you have and in countries that are out and out, dissenting from U.S. hegemony, say Bolivia, you fund these organizations that basically raise the alarm that the country is heading toward dictatorship, and it manipulates the press. I mean, in Bolivia, the reason why that coup didn't take hold is because Evo Morales kicked out AID, and again, the question is to what degree a lot of these programs will continue under different rubrics, but as a symbol of U.S. power, as a symbol of U.S. hegemony, the targeting of AID is very symbolic, I think.
What lessons can history teach us about how to kind of advocate for a just foreign policy in the Americas?
Well, it's hard. It's hard to say because so much of U.S. what we call progress in the United States has been tied to expansion and war. Right, that basically, I think the first thing is that liberals in the United States, and when I say liberals, I mean liberals, that they have to come to terms with the degree to which liberal progress, the expansion of the promise of equality, has been tied to expansion. So during the Jacksonian period, the expansion of suffrage to white, unleaded, and unpropertied men went hand in hand with indigenous removal. The abolition of slavery during the Civil War went hand in hand with the pacification of the West and the expansion and the expansion westward. The progressive era went hand in hand with 1898. Women's suffrage and the growth of the labor movement was tied to tied to mainstream labor movement support for Woodrow Wilson.
Professor, this is not a motivational speech anymore. You're making me feel like any progress we experience here.
It gets worse.
Oh my God!
It gets worse. It goes on and on and on. I mean, but that's broken now. There is no going back to a world in which social justice at home is tied to empire, is brought on the back of empire, and we've got to figure out how to operate in that world, a world of limits, a world of in which we have to focus on we have to put forward a positive vision of the common good, and not just defer, and not just point to the frontier and say, There's the common good.
So history is telling us what not to do. We have to imagine a kind of new future.
Yes.
Wow, that's powerful. Greg Grandin, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thanks for having me.